Oh, hi there. Have we met before? You're looking at me like you know me. Yes? Probably in your mind's eye from your years at religious school. It really doesn't matter if it was Torah Center here at Temple Emmanuel or at a day school in Brooklyn. Learning about a kibbutznik, learning about me, has long been an essential part of Americans' education about the state of Israel. What? Yes, 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 of course. In your time in Torah Center, you probably studied a map of the state of Israel. You most definitely dropped money in a J&F pushki. You probably created a replica Western Wall, but have you ever thought about how much time you've spent learning about me, someone who lives on a kibbutz? Time spent Israeli dancing, or singing Zum Gali Gali, Hechalutz Leman Avodah, pioneering for the sake of work, or learning about collective child rearing and the difference between a kibbutz and a moshav? When you picture Israel, you picture me, someone who lives on a kibbutz. But this marginal phenomenon never grew more than 5% of Israel's population. Let me say that again. At its peak, less than 5% of Israelis lived on a kibbutz. Today, that number is around 1%. All that focus on a kibbutz? Your teachers weren't teaching you about Israel as much as they were holding up a mirror for you to see yourselves. Pedagogically, I suppose that makes sense. As human beings, we all connect with that to which we can relate. And whom can we relate more than ourselves? By valorizing the small segment of the Israeli population that lived on a kibbutz, we taught our children, and indeed an entire generation of Americans, to see themselves in Israelis and to see Israelis as themselves. The plan worked, rapidly building political, economic, and military support for the nascent Jewish state, and there's no way that we could have foreseen the price tag that would later be paid on college campuses, on Instagram and Twitter, and in the court of progressive American opinion today. To understand the price that Israel and the American Jewish community is now paying for the bond that was forged, we first have to understand the bargain that we didn't even know we struck. Think back to what you learned about the kibbutz. If your education was anything like mine, you learned that the kibbutz was a collectivist socialist endeavor undertaken by secular Jews who were looking for a safe haven and who worked hard to make the desert bloom. Sound about right? In a sense, it was right. As Israeli historian Tom Segev writes, the kibbutz did have a central role to play in Israel's development. Militarily, they were guardians of Zionist land, and their patterns of settlement would, to a great extent, determine the country's borders. But now you have some idea how strange it was to make this marginal effort, less than 5% of the population, the predominant focus of your Israel education. So why was it done? Pulling apart what we remember, it becomes striking how little learning about the kibbutz tells us about Israel and how much it says about us. The kibbutz was a collectivist socialist endeavor? Yes, it was. But do you want to guess the political philosophy and party affiliation of the vast majority of American Jews prior to World War II? It was undertaken by secular Jews. Yes, again, it was. But uplifting Israeli secularism gave tacit approval to American Jewish, to our secularism. We too wanted to see ourselves as new Jews rather than as timid scholars. Secular Jews who were looking for a safe haven and worked hard to make the desert bloom? Again, yes, they did. But is there another country that once prided itself on welcoming immigrants from all over the world, creating a melting pot of shared values and a new language where hard work was thought to be the key to a new life? It's not coincidence that Israel education didn't focus on the pious community that survived in Jerusalem for thousands of years, a population that has always been larger than the kibbutznik population. Or it didn't focus on the Mizrahi population, pushed out of Morocco, a population larger than the kibbutznik population. Or it didn't focus on the Persian community driven from Iran, a population similar to the kibbutz population. We, predominantly demographically progressive Ashkenazi American Jews, were taught about those who looked like us, those who thought like us, those who prayed or didn't like us, to quickly solidify support for Israel and to bolster our own Jewish identities. We were handed a mirror, not a comprehensive history, and so was the rest of America. In 1958, Leon Uris published Exodus, a work of historical fiction that took America by storm. It was the top-selling book in more than 20 years, and it remained atop the New York Times bestseller list for 8 months running, and it was made into a blockbuster film. Perhaps more than any other factor, and there were many others, Uris's Exodus popularized American support for Israel. Yes, there is no doubt that in American post-war culture, many felt sympathy for the victims of the Holocaust and argued that Jews were the particular victims of the Nazis and deserved a state as reparation for persecution, as Penn State professor Dr. Michelle Mart explains. And yes, Israel's concurrent rise with America as victorious democratic responses to the Nazi assault on freedom allowed Americans to identify with the spirit and the substance of the new Jewish state, as Professor Matthew Silver writes. But it isn't until Ari Ben Canaan, Uris's hero, and Kitty Fremont, his love interest, entered the picture that Americans were handed the mirror that sealed the deal. Ari Ben Canaan was, in the words of Uris, a strapping 6-footer with black hair and ice blue eyes who could be mistaken for a movie leading man. And when chiseled, dashing, white Paul Newman was cast in the movie role, emerging bare-chested and godlike from the Mediterranean in the nighttime to carry out his secret mission, stoically bearing pain that could have killed an ordinary human being when he was wounded, the American audience saw not their Jewish neighbor, but an image of a sexually appealing Hollywood Western hero, the cowboy that they wanted to be. As a literary work, it isn't much, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister, is rumored to have said, but as a piece of propaganda, it's the greatest thing ever written about Israel. Uris's Exodus furthered their depictions of Israelis as strong and courageous, capable of standing up to the Russians during the Cold War, and being, as Pulitzer Prize winner John Hershey wrote in The New Yorker, surrogate Americans. Quote, Israeli children are regular Californians, sturdy, open-faced, sun-coppered kids, potentially bigger, it seems, than their parents, and perhaps bolder, too. Americans, like American Jews, saw themselves in Israelis, and Israelis in themselves, forging a bond between the two countries so strong that Foreign Service officer David G. Ness in 1971 likened Israel to the 51st state. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, being seen as the 51st state was extraordinarily helpful. In the 2010s and the 2020s, it is far more damaging as the hidden cost of that closeness, or rather, the way that closeness was forged, is now realized. The American public, and still many American Jews, are only peering into a mirror when we look toward Israel. We've erroneously been led to believe that Israel is America and Israelis are Americans, and that Israel is basically the 51st state. And now we assume that their problems are our problems. This disastrous way of thinking, or not thinking, came to a head on college campuses, on Instagram and Twitter, and in the court of progressive American opinion this May. Americans turned toward the flare-up in violence in Israel and saw reflected in the mirror only themselves and Paul Newman and African slaves and the unreconciled atrocities of America's racist past, instead of truly seeing the nuances and challenges of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Until all of our children are safe, Representative Cori Bush of Missouri told the House of Representatives, we will continue to fight for our rights in Palestine and in Ferguson. The hashtag Palestinian Lives Matter was ubiquitous on social media. What they are doing to the Palestinian people is what they continue to do to our Black brothers and sisters here, Representative Rashida Tlaib of Michigan shouted to applause. It is a stunning transference, seeing in a foreign country the American evil of unreconciled racial oppression, and one that has been a long time in the making. White Americans have long believed that Israelis look like them, think like them, and act like them. The Jews that most Americans know are white, and they were taught only of the kibbutznik 5%, instead of the ingathering of exiles from Arab countries or the Sabra population, leaving all in America predisposed to a false black and white racial injustice narrative. As journalist Maddie Friedman writes, the story of the Jewish minority in Europe and in the Islamic world, which is the story of Israel, has nothing to do with race in America. If you stand on a street corner in the modern-day state of Israel and you look at the passers-by, you often can't tell who's Jewish and who's Arab. And indeed, the majority of the Israeli population would be defined by Americans as people of color. Although Israel, like America, Friedman writes, is deeply messed up, it's messed up in completely different ways. None of this is meant to dismiss or to minimize the conflict. Injustice can and does exist beyond race. As Rabbi Joshua Weinberg, the vice president of the URJ for Israel and Reform Zionism and the executive director of Arza writes, and I absolutely agree, the conflict in Israel-Palestine is simply not about race. That doesn't mean there isn't a huge problem. We must be committed to supporting the causes and organizations working on the ground for a shared society between Israeli Jew and Israeli Arab, a two-state arrangement for both Israelis and Palestinians. My words tonight aren't meant to minimize the conflict. Far from it, merely to point out that if your only tool is a hammer, if your only lens is a mirror, we're going to continue to see only ourselves and transpose America's racial past on a country 6,000 miles away, egregiously misunderstanding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. While we can't rewrite the history of the Americanization of Israel in popular conscience, once we realize it's a fallacy, and we realize its damage, and the damage of our inability to see beyond our own mirror, we can realize and exercise other oversimplified, self-centered narratives. We can insist on greater precision of language and less appropriation of others' suffering, and we can challenge ourselves and others to begin thinking about Israel and Palestine rather than only ourselves. Let's start, perhaps, by ditching those oversimplified narratives that are about us rather than the Israelis or the Palestinians. Simplified narratives that match our expectations and conform to our limited frame of reference are almost always wrong. Benjamin Netanyahu isn't Donald Trump. Yair Lapid isn't Joe Biden. Mahmoud Abbas isn't Nelson Mandela. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi isn't Hitler. Israelis aren't white. Palestinians aren't black. The history of Jews in Israel didn't start with British colonialism. Understanding Jim Crow segregation in America doesn't help to understand the plight of the Palestinians. Each of these comparisons is more emotional hook, more intentional effort to blind and seduce by holding up a mirror to our own frame of reference than they are a reflection of reality. Next, let's be wary of those emotionally triggering words and appropriations of others' suffering. As Rabbi Weinberg writes, the usage of terms like apartheid and genocide is intentional. They're floated both to resonate with and be categorized with other familiar and far more tragic stories, and they're designed to touch a Jewish nerve. The term genocide especially resonates with us as Jews, as the victims of the greatest genocidal program in modern history when Nazi Germany attempted to erase us from existence. Neither term is applicable to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They're only emotional hooks, intentional efforts to seduce us and blind us. Who isn't against genocide, right? They're not reflections of reality. Finally, once we understand the challenge presented by the bargain that we didn't even know we struck, we must undertake to think more critically. When you realize that the only lens most Americans have been given to view Israel and, God willing, a future Palestinian state is actually a mirror to see themselves, encourage others to start the process of critical inquiry. Put down that mirror. Encourage others to put down their mirrors. Pick up a book or a journal or a triptych. If you're under 50, imagine printing out Google directions. Israeli politics are multidimensional, right and left of center, yes, but also religious and secular, Jewish and Arab, Russian and Mizrahi, and they are fascinating. Palestinian politics are even more challenging and fascinating still, with national institutions like the Palestinian Authority facing a growing legitimacy crisis on the Palestinian street, and armed groups like Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Fatah Martyrs Brigade filling that leadership vacuum. Race in Israel and the Palestinian territories is more complex still. Mizrahi and Ashkenazi and Persian and Arab and African entangled, and there is a history of the land before British Mandate Palestine. Those thousands of years are really interesting and surprisingly relevant for Jews and Arabs alike. Critical inquiry isn't going to yield easy answers. The smartest people in the world have been breaking their teeth on this one for decades, but it will shatter the oversimplifications and the mere images that Americans see and hold, releasing us from constrained thinking, allowing us to be part of the solution. I'm glad that you learned about me, the kibbutznik. I was an important part of Israel's developing identity. Keep learning about me. Commiserate with my share of the population, no more than 5% of your time. Study as well the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community, currently 12% of the population and growing twice as fast, thinking about what that is going to mean for Israel's future. Learn about the 500,000 Israelis who live in settlements, some illegal outpost trailers and some suburbs of Jerusalem with higher qualities of living at a lower cost. Explore an Israeli Arab village, some 2 million people, to learn about their unique pressures and joys. Talk to an Israeli from Russia or Morocco or Iran or Ethiopia, millions of people, about what their lives would be like without the modern-day state of Israel. We chose not to tell their stories in order to forge an immediate bond with Americans, and we're paying a price for it today. Think about the 5 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, their lives, their challenges, their futures. As Maddie Friedman said, Israel is a small country in the Middle East that has nothing to do with the demons stalking America. We, he says, have our own demons. Conflating them won't make either country's problems easier to solve or understand. And, most importantly of all, for the sake of them all, put down the mirror.